June 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. Hans Muller's hands trembled as he wrote to his mother in bombed-out Hamburg. "Mutti, you won't believe this, but yesterday the Americans served us ice cream. Ice cream. In the middle of Texas. While our cities burn, while their boys die in Normandy, they give us ice cream on Sundays." The guard who censored his letter let it pass, knowing no one in Germany would believe it anyway. By 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners would discover that American captivity was nothing like the propaganda minister had warned them about. Hans set down his pencil and stared at the words he had just written. 6 months ago, when the Americans captured him in Italy, he had prepared himself for death. Or worse, the slow starvation that Goebbels had promised awaited any German soldier foolish enough to surrender to the Americans. The propaganda films had shown skeletal prisoners, beaten guards, and rats fighting over scraps. Hans had hidden a razor blade in his boot, planning to use it before letting himself be tortured. But now that blade sat rusting in a drawer next to his bunk, forgotten like so many other fears he had carried across the Atlantic. The journey to America itself had shattered his first expectations. On the Liberty ship crossing the ocean, German prisoners ate the same meals as American soldiers. White bread with real butter, coffee with sugar, meat that wasn't gray or suspicious. Hans had assumed it was a trick, some psychological game before the real punishment began. But when they reached American soil and boarded trains with actual seats instead of cattle cars, when guards offered them cigarettes and spoke to them in broken German learned from phrase books, when they arrived at Camp Hearn to find wooden barracks with electric lights and running water, Hans began to understand that everything he had been told was a lie. The camp sprawled across the Texas prairie like a small town, which in many ways it had become. 800 German prisoners lived behind the wire, but the wire seemed almost ceremonial. During the day, hundreds of them left to work on local farms, earning 80 cents a day picking cotton or harvesting vegetables. Local farmers competed to request German work crews because they worked hard and caused no trouble. Some farmers' wives packed extra sandwiches for the prisoners, remembering their own German grandparents who had settled this land generations ago. In the evenings, the prisoners returned to find hot showers, clean clothes, and meals that would have been luxury even before the war started. Hans thought of his mother receiving his letter in Hamburg, where the phosphorus bombs had turned entire neighborhoods to ash. She would be mixing sawdust into bread flour to make it stretch another day, while he complained to his bunkmate Wilhelm that the ice cream wasn't chocolate this time. The guilt ate at him worse than hunger ever could. Last week, they had shown a Hollywood movie in the mess hall. Cowboys and Indians racing across a screen while German prisoners munched popcorn, some of them cheering for the Indians because they felt like underdogs too. The absurdity of it made Hans laugh and cry at the same time. The American approach confused them all. Where was the hatred they had been promised? Where was the revenge for American boys dying on French beaches this very week? Instead, there was Captain Bradley, the camp commander, who spoke fluent German from his university days and encouraged prisoners to take English classes. There was Sergeant Johnson, a black soldier from Mississippi, who taught them to play baseball and laughed when they kept trying to catch fly balls with one hand. There was the camp library, stocked with German books and newspapers, though carefully selected ones that showed the reality of the war Germany was losing. There were the doctors who treated prisoner injuries with the same care they gave their own soldiers, using medicines that hadn't been seen in Germany for 2 years. Some prisoners couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance. Klaus from Hans's barracks spent weeks insisting it was all an elaborate deception, that any day the Americans would reveal their true nature. But as months passed, and the only violence came from occasional fights between prisoners themselves, usually about politics or soccer, even Klaus had to admit that perhaps they had been wrong about Americans. Or perhaps Hans thought the Americans were trying to prove something to themselves, showing that democracy and decency could survive even in wartime. As darkness settled over the Texas prairie, Hans picked up his pencil again. He wanted to tell his mother about the prisoner who had started a small garden, growing tomatoes that reminded him of his grandfather's farm. About the camp orchestra that practiced Beethoven in the evenings. About how some guards had started learning German curse words and laughing when prisoners used them. about how strange it felt to be treated as a human being by enemies who had every reason to hate him. But he knew the censors had limits, and besides, would she even believe him if he told her everything? He could barely believe it himself, and he was living it every single day. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the wheat fields surrounding Camp Concordia as Friedrich Wagner lined up with 40 other prisoners for work detail. The American guard, Private Tommy Sullivan, barely 20 himself, was trying to count heads while simultaneously eating a donut and dropping powdered sugar all over his uniform. Friedrich had to suppress a smile. 3 months in American captivity had taught him that these guards were nothing like the SS men who had guarded Soviet prisoners back in Poland. Sullivan finally gave up his formal count and just waved them toward the trucks, muttering something about it being too early for mathematics. The trucks rumbled down dusty Kansas roads toward the Hoffman farm, where corn needed harvesting before the first frost. Friedrich sat in the back, feeling the warm September wind on his face, no rifles pointed at them, no chains on their wrists. The guard riding with them had actually fallen asleep, his helmet tilted over his eyes, trusting that none of these enemy soldiers would try anything foolish. And why would they? Where would they run in the middle of Kansas, thousands of miles from home, when they were eating better than they had in years and earning money that would be waiting for them after the war? At the Hoffman farm, Mrs. Hoffman was already setting up tables under the oak trees. She did this every day the German work crews came, laying out pitchers of cold water, sometimes lemonade, always with extra sandwiches beyond what the camp had provided. Her own son was somewhere in Europe, she had told them once, fighting against boys just like them. But she said hatred was too heavy to carry while doing farm work, and besides, these young men reminded her of the hired hands they used to have before the war took everyone away. Friedrich had learned enough English to thank her, and she had learned enough German to tell them to eat more. They were too skinny. The work was hard but honest. Friedrich had been a bank clerk in Berlin before the war, soft hands that had never known anything rougher than a paper cut. Now those hands pulled corn, fixed fence posts, and drove tractors across endless fields. The physical exhaustion felt clean somehow, different from the bone-deep weariness of war. Here, when you were tired, it was because you had harvested food that would feed people, not because you had marched through mud toward another senseless battle. Some prisoners worked so efficiently that local farmers began requesting specific crews, knowing that Hans from Munich was excellent with machinery or that Karl from Dresden had a gift with animals. During the lunch break, they sat under the trees eating thick ham sandwiches while Mr. Hoffman told them about his grandfather, who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1882. He showed them photographs of the old country that his grandfather had kept, sepia-toned images of villages that might not exist anymore after all the bombing. Friedrich found himself telling Hoffman about his own family's farm near the Rhine, how his father had taught him to read the weather by watching how the cows stood in the field. For an hour, they weren't enemies or prisoners or guards. They were just farmers talking about soil and rain and the way wheat looked when it was ready for harvest. The strangest part was how normal it all began to feel. Friedrich wrote in his diary that evening about how Private Sullivan had tried to learn German curse words during the truck ride back, mangling the pronunciation so badly that the whole truck had erupted in laughter, including Sullivan himself when he realized what he had actually said. He wrote about how they had stopped at a railroad crossing and watched American children walking home from school, some of them waving at the truck full of German prisoners like they were just another work crew. He wrote about the camp soccer match that evening, where guards bet cigarettes on which barracks team would win, cheering as loudly as the prisoners themselves. But beneath the surface of this strange, peaceful life, they all knew the war continued. New prisoners arrived weekly with fresher news from the collapsing fronts. They brought stories of devastated German cities, of the Reich shrinking day by day, of boys younger than Friedrich being thrown into battle with barely any training. The camp authorities made sure prisoners saw newsreels of Allied advances, carefully selected to show the reality without being cruel about it. Many prisoners began to realize they might be the lucky ones, safe in Kansas while their homeland collapsed into chaos. That evening, as Friedrich helped serve dinner in the mess hall, he overheard 2 guards discussing their own fears about being sent to the Pacific now that Europe was nearly won. These Americans who guarded them were not monsters or heroes. They were just young men who wanted to go home, same as the prisoners. The guard who had slept in the truck that morning, Friedrich learned, had been up all night writing letters to his girlfriend in Ohio, worried she might find someone else before he made it home. Even the enemy soldiers keeping them captive were just counting days until peace, measuring time in harvests and seasons and letters from home, all of them caught in the same vast machinery of war that had swept them up from their normal lives and deposited them here in the middle of America, waiting for it all to end. The mess hall had been transformed into something that made Hans stop in the doorway and blink twice to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Paper snowflakes hung from the rafters. A massive pine tree stood in the corner decorated with handmade ornaments, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the air. American guards and German prisoners had spent 3 days preparing for this Christmas Eve celebration, and now, as snow began to fall outside in a rare Texas winter miracle, Hans felt his throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. 6 months ago, he had expected to be dead by Christmas. Instead, he was helping Sergeant Mills arrange plates for a feast that would have been impossible even in pre-war Germany. The packages from the International Red Cross had arrived 2 weeks earlier, one for each prisoner, filled with chocolate, soap, cigarettes, canned meat, and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt acorn substitute they had drunk for the last 2 years of the war. But what had truly broken many of the men wasn't the packages themselves, but the letters tucked inside from the American Red Cross volunteers, wishing them well and hoping they would soon be reunited with their families. Mrs. Dorothy Anderson from Iowa had written to Hans that she knew he was someone's son, perhaps someone's brother or sweetheart, and that she prayed for all mothers waiting for their boys to come home, regardless of which flag they served under. Hans had read that letter 17 times, each time feeling the walls he had built around his heart crack a little more. The camp commander, Captain Bradley, had given permission for the prisoners to organize their traditional Christmas celebration. The camp orchestra, led by Wolfgang, who had been first violin in the Hamburg Symphony before the war, had been practicing Christmas carols for weeks. They had instruments that Bradley had somehow procured from music shops in Houston, and tonight they would play both German and American songs. The kitchen staff, a mix of prisoners and American cooks, had been working since dawn. The prisoners had pooled their camp wages to buy extra ingredients from the canteen, determined to recreate dishes from home. Fritz, who had been a baker in Cologne, had managed to make proper stollen using recipe modifications that would have horrified his grandmother but tasted close enough to bring tears to homesick eyes. As darkness fell and the dinner hour approached, something remarkable happened. The guards who weren't on duty began filing into the mess hall, not as guards but as guests. Private Sullivan brought his harmonica, planning to join the orchestra for a few songs. Sergeant Johnson carried in a box of candy canes mother had sent from Mississippi, insisting they needed to be shared with everyone. Captain Bradley himself entered wearing a slightly ridiculous Santa hat that someone had sent from the States, and instead of looking foolish, it somehow made him look more human, more like someone's father trying to make the best of a difficult Christmas. The meal itself became a mixture of two cultures trying to find common ground through food. American turkey sat next to German potato salad. Cornbread shared plates with sauerkraut that the prisoners had been fermenting for weeks. Sweet potato pie, which none of the Germans had ever tasted before, became an unexpected hit. Hans watched Wilhelm, the stubborn Nazi true believer from his barracks, take a second slice of pie and actually smile at the American cook who had made it. For a moment, ideology melted away in the face of simple human pleasure. After dinner, the orchestra began to play. They started with Silent Night, first in German, then in English, and by the third verse, the entire hall was singing together, 500 German prisoners and 50 American guards, their voices echoing across the Texas prairie. Hans noticed Captain Bradley wiping his eyes during O Tannenbaum, and later learned that Bradley's grandfather had sung it to him in German when he was a child in Minnesota. When Wolfgang announced they would play some American songs, the guards taught the prisoners the words to Jingle Bells, which descended into chaos and laughter as the Germans tried to understand why anyone would want to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. The evening's most powerful moment came when Friedrich stood up and, in carefully practiced English, thanked the Americans for their humanity. He spoke about how they had expected hatred and found kindness, expected revenge and found respect. He said that when this war ended, and they all prayed it would end soon, the prisoners would return to Germany with stories that might help heal the wounds between nations. The hall fell silent after he spoke, and then Captain Bradley stood and raised his coffee cup in a toast to peace, and to the hope that their children would never have to meet as prisoners and guards, but could meet as friends. As Hans walked back to his barracks through the falling snow, he passed the fence where local townspeople had gathered to listen to the music drifting from the camp. Some had brought their own candles, creating a flickering line of lights in the darkness. One elderly woman pressed a Christmas card through the fence into Hans's hand, and though he couldn't read the English words inside, he understood the gesture. That night, lying in his bunk while snow continued to fall in this unlikely Texas winter, Hans thought about his mother in Hamburg, probably spending Christmas in a bomb shelter, and he whispered a prayer that somehow the kindness he had found in this strange place might spread outward like ripples in a pond, reaching all the way back to a world that had forgotten what kindness looked like. The war was over. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers just after lunch, Captain Bradley's voice steady but emotional as he read the official notice of Germany's unconditional surrender. Friedrich Wagner stood frozen in the middle of the baseball field where he had been teaching Private Sullivan how to throw a curveball, the ball dropping from his hand and rolling away into the grass. Around him, 800 German prisoners reacted to the news with a strange mixture of relief, grief, and confusion. Some men fell to their knees weeping, others stood in stunned silence, and a few began arguing about whether it was really true or just another piece of Allied propaganda. Friedrich felt hollow, like someone had scooped out his insides and left only an empty shell that looked like a person but didn't know how to be one anymore. The reaction among the guards was equally complex. Some whooped with joy, throwing their helmets in the air and dancing, because the war ending meant they wouldn't be shipped to the Pacific to fight Japan. Others seemed almost sad, realizing that these strange friendships formed across the wire would soon end. Private Sullivan picked up the baseball and walked over to Friedrich, placing a hand on his shoulder without saying anything, because what could you say to a man whose country had just ceased to exist as he knew it? The game was over, but nobody had won. Not really, not when millions were dead and cities lay in ruins and Friedrich didn't even know if his family had survived the bombing of Dresden 3 months ago. That evening, Captain Bradley called a special assembly. He stood before the prisoners not as a victor addressing the defeated, but as one human being speaking to others about an uncertain future. He explained that they wouldn't be going home immediately. There were forms to process, investigations to complete, and most importantly, Germany itself was in no condition to receive hundreds of thousands of returning prisoners. The country was divided into occupation zones, infrastructure was destroyed, and there was barely enough food for the survivors already there. Some prisoners might be here another year, maybe 2. The hall erupted in dismay until Bradley raised his hand and continued. Those who wanted could volunteer for expanded work programs, earning more money to send home or save for their eventual return. They could take vocational classes, learn trades, improve their English. Some might even qualify for immigration if they wanted to stay in America after their release. The next few days revealed deep divisions among the prisoners that had been suppressed while they shared a common fate. The news trickling in from Germany was horrifying. Photos from concentration camps appeared in newspapers that Bradley made available in the library, and Friedrich watched men he had lived with for months refuse to believe what they were seeing. Klaus insisted the photos were fake, that such things were impossible, but Hans just stared at the images and whispered that he had seen the trains, had wondered where they were going but never asked, never wanted to know. Some prisoners attacked others they suspected of being SS. Investigations began into war crimes, and the unity of shared captivity began to fracture along lines of guilt, denial, and recrimination. Yet life in the camp continued with a surreal normalcy. Farmers still needed help with spring planting, and work crews still went out each morning. Mrs. Hoffman still made extra sandwiches, though now she sometimes asked Friedrich if he had heard from his family, and when he said no, she would pat his arm and promise to pray for them. The camp orchestra still practiced, though their music had taken on a melancholy tone, playing more requiems than celebrations. The baseball games continued, and Friedrich found that throwing a ball as hard as he could at Sullivan's glove was the only thing that made his mind stop racing through possibilities of what he might find when he finally went home. Letters began arriving from Germany in late May, and the mail call became either the best or worst moment of each day. Friedrich watched Hans receive a letter from his mother saying she had survived, but their house was gone, his father was missing, and his younger brother had been drafted in the last days and never came home. He watched Wilhelm get notification that his wife had been killed in an air raid in February while he had been complaining about the food in Texas. He watched Otto learn that his family farm was now in the Soviet zone and he could never return there. Friedrich received nothing, which was almost worse than bad news because it left him suspended between hope and despair, unable to grieve or rejoice. By the end of May, some prisoners had begun to embrace the idea of staying in America. They studied English with newfound intensity, asked American guards about sponsorship programs, and wrote to distant relatives who had emigrated decades earlier. Others retreated into bitter nationalism, insisting Germany would rise again, that this was just a temporary setback. Most, like Friedrich, existed in a strange middle ground, grateful to have survived, guilty about that survival, uncertain whether they belonged to a country that no longer existed or could ever belong to the country that had imprisoned them with such unexpected kindness. They were men without nations, suspended between a past that was gone and a future they couldn't imagine, playing baseball in Kansas while the world reorganized itself around the crater where their homeland used to be. Hans Mahler stood in the administration office holding papers that would either send him back to Hamburg or keep him in America forever. 10 months had passed since Germany's surrender, and the camp was slowly emptying as prisoners were processed for repatriation or, in rare cases, approved for immigration. Hans had spent sleepless nights agonizing over this choice, writing and rewriting letters to his mother explaining why he might not come home, tearing them up each time because the words sounded like betrayal. The American immigration officer, Mr. Peterson, sat patiently across the desk, having seen this same tortured expression on dozens of faces over the past months. He had learned not to rush these moments when men decided which life they would live. The opportunity had come through Mr. Thompson, the dairy farmer who had employed Hans on work details for the past year. Thompson had lost his own son in Normandy, a fact Hans learned only after months of working side by side with the grieving father. Yet Thompson had written a sponsorship letter saying Hans was the best farmhand he'd ever employed, honest and hardworking, and that he would guarantee him a job and housing if he chose to stay. The letter sat in Hans's pocket like a lead weight, offering a future that felt both like salvation and abandonment. His mother's last letter had described Hamburg as a moonscape of rubble where people lived in basements and searched garbage for food, where his sister traded their grandmother's china piece by piece for potatoes, where nobody talked about the war or what they had done or allowed to be done. Friedrich had already made his choice, signing papers to return to Germany despite having no family waiting for him. He said he needed to help rebuild, that running away to American comfort while Germany suffered would be a cowardice he couldn't live with. Hans understood, but wondered if staying might be its own form of courage, becoming living proof that Germans could be something other than what the war had made them. The camp had received visits from former German immigrants who had fought in the American army, men who spoke German with Texas accents and showed that identity could be rebuilt, transformed into something new. One of them, Corporal Schmidt from New Braunfels, had told Hans that America was a country where you could choose who to become instead of being trapped by who you had been. The camps were changing as repatriation accelerated. Where once there had been 800 prisoners, now only 200 remained, rattling around in barracks built for 4 times their number. The baseball diamond grew weeds, the orchestra had dissolved as musicians shipped home, and the vegetarian garden that Hans had tended so carefully was returning to prairie grass. Guards who had become friends were reassigned or discharged, replaced by newcomers who didn't know the prisoners' names or stories. Private Sullivan had left in January, shaking Friedrich's hand and promising to write, though both knew he wouldn't. The closeness born of shared captivity was dissolving as the world returned to its normal divisions. Those who had decided to return home spent their days in preparation classes, learning about the occupation zones, the new German government being formed, the denazification process they would undergo. They were warned about food shortages, housing crises, and the challenge of finding work in a country where most factories had been bombed or dismantled. Some prisoners who had already returned wrote back describing conditions that made camp life seem luxurious by comparison. One letter from Wilhelm, posted from the British zone, described living in a Nissen hut with 30 other men, receiving fewer calories per day than they had enjoyed in Texas, and being treated with suspicion by both occupiers and Germans who had never left. He ended his letter with bitter irony, saying he missed the American prison where he had been more free than he was now in liberated Germany. The prisoners choosing immigration faced different challenges. They studied American history and government for citizenship tests that seemed impossibly distant. They practiced English until their jaws ached, trying to soften accents that marked them as enemy aliens. They wrote letters to churches and civic organizations, looking for sponsors and jobs, selling themselves as reformed men who would be good Americans. Some faced investigations into their military service, answering questions about units they had served in, orders they had followed or refused, their knowledge of atrocities. Hans had been lucky, his service record clean, just another Wehrmacht soldier swept up in the machine. Others were not so fortunate, their SS tattoos or party memberships closing doors before they could even knock. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat gently, bringing Hans back to the present moment. The papers required a simple signature, but Hans knew that single stroke of pen would divide his life into before and after. He thought of his mother receiving his letter explaining that he would send money but wouldn't be coming home, at least not yet. He thought of Mr. Thompson's farm, the clean white house where he would live, the small Texas town where everyone would know him as the German prisoner who stayed. He thought of Friedrich returning to ruins while he milked cows in morning sunshine. The pen felt impossibly heavy as he picked it up, and as he signed his name, Hans felt something tear inside him, not painfully but finally, like a bandage being removed from a healed wound. He was choosing the future over the past, hope over guilt, and though it felt like betrayal, it also felt like the first free choice he had made in 7 years of war and captivity.